Potassium chloride at 3 times the therapeutic dose stops a human heart in under 4 minutes. Clara Devlin had learned that in her second year of pharmacology, sandwiched between a chapter on renal compensation and a brutal midterm, she'd somehow passed on 4 hours of sleep. She never imagined she'd be using that knowledge to save the life of the man whose organizations had sent 2 people to her brother's apartment last Thursday and broken his hand in 4 places. But 6 hours before, she found herself sprinting down the darkened service corridor of Harmont Medical Center. At 2 in the morning, her only concern was whether the autoclave in the East Supply Room had finished its cycle. Room 704 was just another assignment, another VIP patient, another set of post-op orders and medication windows, and monitoring checks to log before dawn. Harmont's 7th floor existed in a different universe from the rest of the hospital. The linoleum gave way to muted grey carpeting. The fluorescent lighting softened to warm amber sconces. The smell of industrial cleaner was replaced by something neutral and expensive, almost spa-like. The kind of environment where a room cost $12,000 a night, and the patients were insulated from the indignity of illness by sheer accumulated wealth. Clara had worked this floor for 2 years and had never once forgotten that she was the help. The uniform made sure of that. She adjusted her ID badge, tucked her tablet under her arm, and knocked twice on the door of 704 before pushing it open. The first thing she noticed was that the room contained 3 men who were definitely not patients or attending physicians. They stood at measured intervals along the walls, broad-shouldered and watchful, wearing suits that cost more than Clara's monthly rent. The good kind of private security, the kind whose presence alone was meant to communicate a message about what happened to people who tested it. The second thing she noticed was Mikhail Sobol. He was sitting up in the adjustable bed with the kind of stillness that didn't come from weakness. 52 years old, according to the chart, though he looked simultaneously younger and older in ways that were difficult to reconcile. His face was sharp-boned and weathered, the face of a man who had spent decades making decisions that other people flinched away from. His hair was silver-streaked and pushed back from his forehead. A cardiac monitoring lead ran under the collar of his dark navy pajama top, his own, not a hospital gown. An IV line fed into his left arm. A glass of water sat untouched on the bedside table. He was reading something on a tablet. He did not look up when Clara entered. 11 o'clock vitals check, she said, her voice holding its professional register. I'll try not to disturb you. One of the suited men stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the quiet certainty of someone who moved through the world expecting it to yield. Leave the equipment. Someone will manage it. The monitoring system requires a licensed nurse to complete the entry, Clara said without breaking eye contact with the wall behind him. Hospital policy. 4 minutes. A pause. Sobol still hadn't looked up, then without inflection, let her work, Brennan. The man moved aside. Clara went to the monitoring station. She worked efficiently, checking leads, logging blood pressure, noting the overnight fluid balance. Her hands were steady. She was good at keeping her hands steady when the rest of her wasn't. She had learned that discipline early, during her 3rd month on the floor, when a patient had coded mid-shift and she'd had to maintain chest compressions for 6 minutes, while the crash team was 3 floors away. You partitioned yourself. The part that was afraid went somewhere small and quiet, and the part that had a job to do took over the body entirely. The part that was afraid was working overtime right now. Because Clara Devlin had not been assigned to floor 7 by accident tonight, she had asked for it, had traded shifts with another nurse, claimed a scheduling conflict, and requested room 704 specifically. Not because she was particularly brave. Because 3 weeks ago her younger brother Finn had borrowed $40,000 from a lending operation called Meridian Capital Partners, believing the terms were aggressive but manageable, not understanding that Meridian was a shell inside a framework of entities that ultimately answered to the man currently hooked up to a cardiac monitor in front of her. Finn had lost most of it in 10 days, a bad opportunity, a worse judgment call. He was 24 years old, and he trusted the wrong people, and he was the only family Clara had left. And last Thursday evening, 2 men had knocked on his door and illustrated the consequences of a missed deadline in terms that were physical, direct, and sent him to urgent care with a splintered hand and a 48-hour warning that the next conversation would be different in nature. Clara had spent 72 hours trying to find another way out. There wasn't one, not a legal one. She finished the vitals log and stood. She should leave. Every sensible, self-preserving instinct she possessed said to leave. Instead, she looked at Mikhail Sobol, who had, at some point during her charting, set his tablet down and was now watching her with an expression that was neither hostile nor welcoming but purely evaluative. And she said, "Mr. Sobol, I need 5 minutes of your time." The silence that followed had weight. She felt all 3 men in the room shift almost imperceptibly in her peripheral vision. "Brennan," Sobol said. "She's clean." Brennan's voice was flat. "Checked her credentials when she came on shift. Badge is current. She's been on this floor 2 years. Sobol looked at her. Not the way most men looked at women in service roles, through them, or past them, or at the convenient surface of them. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at a contract he wasn't sure he should sign, trying to locate the risk. 5 minutes, he said, is a significant ask from someone I've never spoken to. "I know," Clara said. "I'm asking anyway." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, more like a recalibration, an instrument registering an unexpected reading. He said one more quiet word to Brennan, and the 3 men moved to the outer anteroom. The door pulled partially shut behind them. Sobol set down his water glass without drinking from it. "You have 4 minutes remaining, Miss Devlin, Clara Devlin." She kept her voice even. "My brother is Finn Devlin. He borrowed $40,000 from Meridian Capital Partners. He can't repay it. The deadline passed 2 days ago, and the men you sent have already made 1 visit." Sobol's expression didn't flicker. "Meridian is a private lending institution. If your brother has a dispute with their collections process." "We both know what Meridian is," Clara said. Her voice stayed level, and she was honestly surprised by that. "I'm not here to pretend otherwise. I'm here because I spent the last 3 weeks going through Meridian's public filings, their Delaware registration, their subsidiary documentation, and every publicly accessible corporate record attached to the entities that trace back to your name." She paused. "I'm not a lawyer, but I had 2 years of accounting coursework before I switched to nursing, and I know what legitimate loan documentation looks like versus what constructed paperwork looks like." Sobol was quiet. "You spent 3 weeks doing that." "I didn't have a better option." "And you came here tonight to, what exactly? Use that as leverage?" "No." Clara shook her head. "I came to make you an offer. Forgive Finn's debt. In exchange, I'll do whatever analytical work you need from someone who knows how to read financial records, trace fund movements, and keep her mouth shut. I'm already invisible in this building. Nobody notices the night nurse. I've had access to information about half the executives in this city just by being the person who adjusts their IV bags when they think no one is observing them." She held his gaze. "I'm not a criminal. I'm a woman who is completely out of options. There's a difference." Sobol studied her for a long moment. "Your brother sounds like a man with a talent for poor decisions." "He's 24, Clara said. "He's all I have left." Something moved briefly behind Sobol's eyes, unnameable, gone before she could identify it. He leaned back against the elevated headboard, the monitoring leads shifting slightly. "I'll give you an answer before your next medication round," he said. "Until then, do your job, and don't do anything that requires me to reconsider letting you leave this room." It was not a yes, but it was not a no, and Clara had walked into that room holding nothing but a desperate theory and a willingness to say it out loud, so she took what she had and walked out. She was 3 steps down the hallway, her pulse finally beginning to slow, when she stopped. Something was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not visibly wrong. The kind of wrong that registered first as an itch at the back of the brain, the same instinct that had made her double-check a potassium drip 2 years ago and caught a decimal point error that would have been fatal. Clara had learned long ago to trust that itch, even when she couldn't immediately explain it. She turned back to the nursing station and pulled up Sobol's medication schedule on the terminal. The 11 p.m. orders were correct. She'd verified them herself. But the 2 a.m. orders, the second window of post-operative anticoagulation management, had been modified. She could see the timestamp, 9:47 p.m. 3 hours ago, after the attending physician had left for the evening. Someone had altered the heparin infusion parameters in the system. Clara sat down slowly. She made herself look at the numbers carefully, the way her accounting professor had taught her to approach a ledger that wasn't balancing. Assume nothing. Follow what's actually there. Don't fill gaps with what you expect to see. At 2 a.m., if the modified order was dispensed as entered, Mikhail Sobol would receive an anticoagulant dose sufficient to cause uncontrollable internal hemorrhage. A man 3 days post-cardiac procedure would not survive that, and in the morning it would look like a tragic miscalculation. A documentation error, the kind of terrible thing that happened in complex medical cases. Her hands had gone very cold. She checked the modification log. The edit had been processed through a physician-level portal, but the attending had signed out at 6 p.m., and the on-call cardiologist had been in contact with her twice by phone about a different patient and nowhere near this floor. The authentication token used to make the change belonged to a Dr. Yusuf Crane, who was on approved medical leave and hadn't badged into the building in 11 days. Someone had used stolen physician credentials to enter a lethal medication order into the system. Clara's hands were moving before the full implication had finished assembling itself. She was already calling the night pharmacist, already placing a clinical hold on the 2 a.m. dispense, already beginning the incident documentation that would make any reversal a formal, traceable clinical action, not a quiet erasure that left no record behind. Then she went back to room 704. Brennan stepped in front of the door. Medication rounds aren't until. I know, Clara said. Tell Mr. Sobol it's about his 2 o'clock. A pause. Brennan spoke quietly into an earpiece. Then he stepped aside. Sobol was no longer in bed. He was standing at the window looking down at the city, the IV line extended on its portable stand beside him. He turned when she entered, and she could see in his face that he had already processed the fact that she'd come back ahead of schedule and was running the calculation of what that meant faster than most people could. Someone modified your anticoagulation order this evening, she said without building up to it. Using a stolen physician credential. If it had been dispensed at 2 a.m. as entered, it would have killed you. She set her tablet on the bedside table with the medication log open. I've placed a clinical hold on it. There's a formal incident trail now. Whoever did this is going to have to explain it. And they can't make the documentation disappear without making the disappearance visible. Sobol looked at the tablet. He looked at her. Who had the access to enter a modification like that? A physician-level portal, but the credential was stolen from a doctor who hasn't been in this building in nearly 2 weeks. Clara held her ground. Someone who wanted this to look like a medical error needed 3 things: stolen credentials, advanced knowledge of your medication schedule, and enough familiarity with hospital eye architecture to execute it without triggering routine monitoring alerts. She paused. The only person who accessed your room tonight before I arrived, with connections that could provide all 3, was a man who signed in as your representative at 8:30 p.m. Tristan Keene, your chief of staff. The quality of the silence changed entirely. That is a serious accusation, Sobol said, his voice quiet and controlled in a way that was more unsettling than volume would have been. I know. If you're wrong. I've been wrong before, Clara said. Not about numbers. She pulled up the second document on her tablet, The file she'd been building for 3 weeks, originally for her own understanding, her own attempt to map the structure of the thing that had taken her brother. Meridian's third quarter filings show a $22 million cash movement with no corresponding loan portfolio documentation. It routes through a Delaware LLC called Hartwell Acquisitions. The signature pattern on Hartwell's incorporation documents matches the digital signature profile on Tristan Keen's registered business filings in New York. She looked up from the screen. He has been moving money out of your organization for at least 8 months. Tonight, I think he decided it was time to make sure you couldn't find out. Sobol had gone absolutely still, not the stillness of shock. The stillness of a decision being made the way a circuit breaker trips, instantaneous, complete, no intermediate state. He moved to the bedside phone, said 3 words that Clara didn't fully follow but understood the shape of. Then he looked at her. "Sit down, Ms. Devlin," he said, "and don't open that door for anyone who doesn't clear themselves to Brennan's satisfaction first." What happened on the other side of that door over the next 40 minutes, Clara could not see and did not ask about. She sat in the chair beside the monitoring station and listened to voices kept deliberately low, and the particular compressed efficiency of people very experienced at resolving problems that fell outside the jurisdiction of anyone she could have called instead. She had grown up understanding that certain processes required a witness and not a participant, and she was good at being still. She heard Tristan Keen's voice once, raised, then not, and then the corridor outside went quiet. When Sobol came back into the room, he was alone. He looked precisely the same as he had an hour ago, which was either extraordinary self-discipline or evidence that this kind of evening was not, for him, entirely outside the range of normal. He settled carefully back into the adjusted bed, a man who respected what his surgeons had told him about incision sites, and looked at her for a long moment. "Tristan Keen has been my chief of staff for 11 years, he said. He had access to everything I built. When trust of that kind is abused at this scale," he stopped. "The damage he did in 8 months would have taken 2 years to unravel without someone who already knew exactly where to look." "I wasn't looking for it," Clara said honestly. "I was looking for a way to save my brother." "And you found something considerably larger." A pause. "Finn Devlin's debt is cleared as of tonight. He'll have documentation by morning." The relief that moved through Clara was not the composed, professional kind. It was the kind that came from somewhere too deep to manage, the kind that embarrassed you with its intensity, and she let it move through her and didn't pretend it wasn't there. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet." Sobol's voice was dry but not unkind. "I'm now rebuilding the financial oversight structure of several significant enterprises with no chief of staff, a compromised accounting team, and a timeline that is less forgiving than I would like." He looked at her with that same flat, assessing steadiness. "You said you were out of options. As it happens, so am I." Clara looked at the IV line in his arm, at the cardiac leads still drawing their patient peaks on the monitor, at the man attached to all of it, who moved through the world in ways she didn't fully understand and had chosen, tonight, not to look through her. "I'm a nurse," she said carefully, "not a financial analyst, not an investigator, not anything that belongs in your world." 3 weeks ago, Sobol said, "with no resources, no staff, and no authority, you accurately mapped the shell structure of one of my subsidiary organizations and identified a long-term embezzlement scheme that my entire professional security apparatus missed. You did that between overnight shifts in a hospital." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm not asking you to stop being a nurse. I'm asking you to stop pretending that's the only thing you are." Clara was quiet. She thought about Finn, about the way he'd looked in the urgent care waiting room, trying to minimize the splint on his hand because he knew she was frightened and he was still, at 24, trying to absorb her worry for her. She thought about how small his mistakes were against the scale of the system that had been positioned to swallow them whole. She thought about Tristan Keen, 11 years of trust, $22 million, and stolen physician credential entered into a hospital system at 9:47 on a Tuesday night. She thought about what it meant to be the person who had noticed, and what it would mean going forward that she had. "If I say yes," she said, "I want something in writing about Finn. Not just debt clearance documentation, something that makes him permanently unreachable by anyone connected to your operations for any reason indefinitely." The corner of Sobol's mouth moved, not quite a smile, the close relative of one. "You negotiate like someone who thought about this before tonight." "I did." "Then we understand each other." He extended his hand across the bedside, not across a ballroom floor, not between a tailored suit and a waiter's uniform, just across the space between one careful adult and another. "My attorneys will draft the language by morning. You can review it before you sign anything." Clara looked at his hand. She thought about the fact that she was a night shift nurse who had just watched a man she'd met 2 hours ago make the kind of quiet phone call that resolved situations like Tristan Keane. She thought about the fact that she was not afraid of that, not in the way she'd expected to be. She probably should have been. She thought about the 2 a.m. dispense that was now formally held, logged, documented in triplicate, impossible to quietly undo, and the fact that she had followed an instinct she couldn't immediately explain and had been right, and that being right had mattered in a way that no one in her professional life had ever suggested it could. She placed her hand in his. "I have a 4 o'clock medication round," she said. "I still need to finish my shift." Sobol's expression was dry, but something moved behind it that wasn't distance. "Of course, Miss Devlin, do your job." She did her job. She moved through the remainder of the night with the same steadiness she brought to every shift, logging vitals, adjusting lines, answering the call light in 7:09, writing up the incident report on the medication order modification with the careful clinical neutrality the documentation required. At 5:47 a.m. she handed off to the day nurse, clocked out and rode the elevator down to the lobby. The city outside was still mostly dark. A delivery truck moved along the far end of the block. Somewhere above the entrance canopy, a bird was starting to reconsider its options about the weather. Clara sat on the concrete bench outside the employee entrance and let herself shake for a while. She had decided beforehand that if she survived the night, she was allowed to shake afterward, and she was a woman who honored the promises she made to herself. When her phone buzzed, it was a text from Finn. "Hey, are you working tonight?" "Somebody dropped off paperwork at the apartment. Looks official. I don't understand it. Call me when you're up." She typed back, "I'll explain everything. Don't open the door for anyone today. I'll be there by noon." She put the phone in her pocket and looked at the sky. That particular dark blue that lived between night and morning, the color that belonged exclusively to people who never stopped working. She didn't know yet if she'd made the right choice. She knew enough about the world she'd just agreed to stand adjacent to. The exits were narrower than the entrance, and a man who never forgot things could mean very different outcomes depending entirely on which side of him you were standing on. She understood that she had not walked away from danger tonight. She had walked toward it with her eyes open, which was a different thing, and she wasn't yet sure whether that made it better or worse, or simply what it was. But she also knew that her brother would wake up this morning with a hand that would heal, and no debt that wouldn't, and that she had done that with nothing but 2 abandoned years of coursework, 3 weeks of lost sleep, and the decision to trust the itch at the back of her brain when it told her something in room 704 was not what it appeared to be. The day nurse passed through the lobby doors behind her with a coffee and a tired nod. Clara straightened up, pulled her bag onto her shoulder, and walked toward the parking structure. She had a noon appointment and a story to figure out how to tell, and she had never yet failed to show up for either. Did Clara Devlin just make the most dangerous mistake of her life? Or did she just find the one room in this city where being invisible was finally worth more than being seen? The world she stepped into doesn't offer second chances, And Mikhail Sobol doesn't forget a debt any more than he forgives one. Drop a like if you want to follow where this goes. Share this with someone who knows that the smartest person in any room is usually the one nobody's watching. And subscribe to Dark King Stories so you don't miss what comes next. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Taken the hand or walked out the door? Tell us in the comments.